what are institutions in the first place, right? So institutions are first and foremost rules of the game that govern the behavior of individuals and organizations, or any sort of economic agent in a given economy. They are formal rules, right? So institutions are first and foremost formal rules like laws and regulations. So a very common mistake is to confuse institutions and organizations, right? So they're not one and the same thing. Right? They're not one and the same thing. I mean, university is an organization. It's not an institution in this sense of the rule of the game which impact the behavior of individuals and organizations. Right? So an institution related, to the universities, a rule stipulated by the school regulation that you must show up at seminars. So this is a formal rule. It is an institution, right? It's an institution in that sense, right? So you shouldn't confuse the two. So what do institutions do? Well, first and foremost, they sort of provide you with some examples. They provide incentives for individuals and companies and all sorts of economic agents in an economy and society to engage in socially productive or wasteful activities, right? Socially productive in terms of education, investment, and innovation, right? So institution, for example, it would stimulate education would be to stipulate that, you're obliged, you must be in school until you finish high school, until you're 16 or 18. And this is the case in majority of developed economies, right? So this is an institution that says it's a formal rule, stipulated by law that you must be in school until you're 16 or 18. And such a rule, such an institution is obviously going to stimulate education, right? It's going to impact your behavior. You must go to school whether you like it or hate it, right? But presumably it is good for the economy because it's going to boost your education, boost your productivity, and hence influence economic growth. So this is the case of a positive institution, right? You can think of various such cases. Such cases, according to Acemoglu and Robinson, they provide a very simple and sort of neat framework. I mean, obviously the reality is more complex, but they provide a very neat framework to try to understand institution. This is the obligatory reading material you have to do, so you have to read them, Acemoglu and James Robinson. They argue that bad type of institutions are so-called extractive institutions, right? And define extractive institutions as those that are essentially designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many, right? Benefit the few at the expense of the many. So sort of a classic extractive institution in history would be slavery. Right? I mean, it's obviously not designed to benefit those that are enslaved, but those who are owners of the slaves. So this is a classical example of an extractive institution. Slavery benefits the owners of slaves as it decreases the cost of capital and hence boosts profit margin in the plantations where slaves work or where they work. More generally speaking, extractive institutions are characterized by insecure property rights. And I mean, non-existent of property rights of your labor is slavery. So this would be a sort of an extreme case of insecure property rights. I mean, essentially, you don't have right over your own labor, right? You're forced to work at the plantation. You can't sell your labor. You can't bid your labor, right? So this is an extreme case of insecure property rights or non-existent property rights for a large segment of the population in many societies in many periods of time. They also characterize dictatorships as being extractive, right? They're designed as institutions, at least politically, to benefit a small, tiny elite at the expense of the many. Also limited markets, right? So historically limited markets would, for example, be guilds, right? So in medieval times, in Middle Ages, for example, to be a shoemaker, you had to be a part of the shoemakers guild, right? And you had to pay a fee, and you usually had to be sponsored by an existing shoemaker, right? So these kind of guilds were essentially restricting market entry. They were putting barriers to entry into market, and hence they were, boosting their profits by essentially limiting competition, right? So again, an institution that was then designed essentially to benefit the few, which were, shoemakers in a guild, versus all the other people out there who maybe wanted to become shoemakers but couldn't realize their dreams because of these guilds that were handicapping them, right? Acemoglu and Robinson then, contrast this to inclusive institutions which are beneficial for economic growth. Inclusive institutions are characterized as secure property rights, tend to be characterized by democracy, and tend to be characterized by free markets, right? So using their framework, as they also write in the book chapter, I think given North Korea would then be characterized by something like extractive institutions, and South Korea, according to their classification, would be characterized by inclusive institutions, right? Obviously, things are a little bit more complicated than that, especially the point on, for example, democracy versus dictatorship, right? So, South Korea was essentially dictatorship until about 1980s, right? Until about 1980s, well, we know it was developing very rapidly before that. We also know, that socialist economies until the 1980s in Europe were developing very rapidly. China is a very special case. Politically, obviously, it is ruled by communist elite, but it's characterized by a market economy, right? So things are a little bit more complicated. Just the point on democracy here. It's sort of citizens of the West, raised by certain norms and ideals. Obviously, we want to believe that democracy is good for economic growth. And generally speaking, we do know that the majority of developed economies nowadays are democratic states, right? But which way the relationship runs is obviously very complex and very complicated, right? You could say, yes, democracy causes economic development, but you could also say that economic development causes democracy, right? In a way that democracy is a luxury good that only rich countries can afford, right? So that the evidence on this point, a little bit mixed. On secure property rights and open markets, pretty much unambiguous, right? At least when it comes to high levels of development. So to give you a historical example, French Revolution that happened under the regime of Louis XVI is an obvious case of the importance of institutions and how they transform. These institutions tend to be very rigid, but they can change, although they typically do change under severe stress. Like, for example, the French Revolution, right? So institutions are very rigid, but they can change, right? Although not very frequently in a very dramatic way, but they do tend to change, at least occasionally. So France in the 18th century, for example, was ruled by the absolute monarchy, characterized by this ancient regime, which was essentially a system of corporate privileges. Using the terminology of Acemoglu and Robeson, this ancient regime was essentially a system of extractive institutions, right? Privileges were limited to the aristocratic elite and the church at the expense of the majority of the population, and the majority of the population back then were the peasants, essentially, right? Similar to the Glorious Revolution I talked about, that came before the Industrial Revolution in last week, venal offices were sold by kings to raise funds. This means, again, to become a baron or a duke or something like that, it was enough to pay a huge amount of money to become a baron and a duke. And if you would become a baron and a duke, you would be protected, for example, by the law versus the French peasants who were not. So you can sort of buy your entry into the elite, but in a very untransparent fashion, not through your meritocracy, but rather just, through the amount of wealth you owned. France, as majority of countries back then, was characterized by guilds that had monopoly rights and protection. Right? So there were extreme entry barriers to markets. You had to become a member of a guild in order to produce whatever you wanted, generally speaking. Then came the revolution, which overthrew the ancient regime. Privileges were abolished, venal offices were suppressed, political representation, at least initially before Napoleon and everybody Robespierre, through elected officials, guilds were destroyed and equality before law was established. The French Revolution, which is itself inspired by the American Revolution, is probably the single most important sort of institutional event in Europe's history because it, inspired all sorts of institutional transformations in Europe, inspired, these notions of secularity, rule of law, individual rights, so on and so forth, right? Essentially, this idea of inclusive institutions was developed and promoted throughout Europe, right? So just a point on, actually, weirdly enough, Acemoglu and Robinson, James Robinson, he's actually going to come to the social sciences department, I think next week to give a presentation. So you can see economic history seminars, if you want to see live one of the persons who is writing the material you're forced to read, you can do that if you tend to be interested. He's an exceptional individual, exceptional, intelligent person, right? So it's a pleasure to have him here. So another source of economic growth beyond and above institutions is geography, right? Geography. And you can see here pretty simply, latitude correlated with GDP per capita. Latitude is basically how distant you are from the equator, right? And you can see that countries that are typically more distant from the equator, they're further away, from the equator, tend to be more rich than the countries that are pretty much located at the equator. Right? So there's definitely something about geography, where you are located in the world, that shapes your economic development, right? So just being close to the equator or being further from the equator somehow maybe shapes your development. And one of the explanations given for this relationship, distance from the equator, so basically these are sort of more temperate zones, like France, Germany, this is jungles, that basically these countries, by sheer unluck of their location, tend to be characterized by a more disastrous disease environment. For example, malaria is more common, yellow, all sorts of diseases and so on and so forth, right? Next to that, these countries tending to be characterized by sort of more malicious disease environment. Importantly, we talked about how for poorer economies, it tends to make more sense to copy technologies from the rich countries rather than to innovate them themselves, right? The problem here is, in agriculture in particular, and all these countries that are super poor here are agricultural, they can't really import agricultural technologies from here, right? Agricultural technologies, in the temperate zones of the world were primarily designed, to grow grain, right? They weren't designed for tropical conditions, right? So they have extreme time adopting at least agricultural technologies, which is then limiting their economic growth, right? So even if they have, good institutions, good culture, and so on and so forth, right, they have a very hard time adopting agricultural technologies, which were designed and developed for the local economic conditions of being here, this part of the world when it comes to distance from the equator, right? So geography, ultimately bad luck here. Geography also, through not only impacting disease environment and how easy or not it is to import technologies, at least related to agriculture, is also important for purely shaping your market access, right? Market access. So we see here market access as a function of GDP per capita. Countries that tend to have better market access are also tremendously more richer. So market access means how close you are to very rich countries, weighted by your average degree of protection. So basically how close it is, how easy it is for you to export your goods to a very rich economy, right? So this means if you are here, and these are probably landlocked sub-Saharan economies, they're in the middle of nowhere, right? So even if they have goods, materials to export to rich economies, it's extremely difficult and extremely costly to export to Europe, right? They're very far away, so it takes a lot of money, to ship this over the sea or something like that. But if all of your neighbors are also poor, and maybe they're engaged in civil wars, you can't really ship your goods over their territories, right? So you basically, but bad luck, right? So ultimately, this sort of economic geography explanation argues that what shapes economic growth is basically by your neighbors, right? If you're surrounded by rich neighbors, you're more likely to be rich yourself, right? You're more likely to be rich yourself. So this is sort of a circular argument, but we see this very clearly in the data. So one of the geographical explanations why economic growth can be impacted is, first and foremost, the environment and agricultural stability of adopting technologies, which is primarily, sort of the case for Africa, and also market access, so how far you are from very rich and big markets. Thirdly, and sort of more historically, initial geographical conditions, geography not only matters in indirect ways, for shaping disease environment and agricultural stability, and not only for impacting market access, it also has an indirect impact through shaping institutions that are developed, right? So it also has an indirect impact for shaping institutions. But let's kind of leave that on the back burner just for a little bit. Just focus on the role of market access. So you can see here very explicitly, that North America is characterized by extremely, big market access, in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and then, finally Sub-Saharan Africa tends to be characterized by the lowest amount of market access, right? So one of the sort of fundamental explanations here, okay, North America is rich because basically it's the Atlantic, you can communicate with Europe very easily. Sub-Saharan African countries are very poor because, they're in the middle of nowhere, essentially, right? Especially if you're a landlocked Sub-Saharan economy. So there's this paper by Redding and Venables, and they argue that access to markets can explain between 60 and 70% of overall variation in income across countries, and that moving 50% closer to your trading partners can lift your income by 25%, or essentially being close to rich neighbors is good for growth. So Sri Lanka is a super interesting example. They provide in their paper. So Sri Lanka, an island close to India, so pretty much, in the middle of nowhere in terms of economic activity. So they estimate that, if Sri Lanka was not an island, if, for example, it was connected to India by land, income would increase by 7% automatically. And so it would be automatically much easier for the Sri Lankans to sell their goods to foreign markets because they don't have to ship this over the sea over large distances. Income would be 20% higher if it didn't put also additional tariff barriers, protectionist measures, sort of self-defeating measures, right? And sort of most interesting to kind of illuminate all of these issues, they estimate that moving Sri Lanka from its position in the world to say putting it into the middle of Europe, Central Europe, Sri Lanka just moves its position, it has the same institutions, same culture, its income would go up by 67%, right? Tremendously higher because it would be then surrounded by very big and very rich economies, right? So this would mean that, for example, a country like Switzerland is extremely rich because it has extremely big and rich neighbors around itself. It can sell its goods very easily because there's a big export demand for its goods and services, right? So geography also matters, perhaps even more importantly, especially in sort of historical perspective, for shaping institutions, right? And we know that geography certainly shaped institutions that were developed in Africa and also in North and South America. Right, so basically the sort of underlying observation is that the New World, so the Americas, were characterized by two types of colonies. Right, so this is an extremely Eurocentric sort of perspective on world development, but it makes sense because Europeans went there. So there were settler colonies like United States and Canada. Right, settler colonies in the sense, this is where the Europeans moved to actually live. Right, they maybe eradicated indigenous people like Native Americans, but essentially they moved there to live. Other type of institutions were plantation and extractive colonies like Latin America and the Caribbean, right? Where Europeans obviously moved, but not to such very large extent as they moved to North America. And this had tremendous implication on the development of their institutions. So colony type, whether it was a settler colony or an extractive colony, depended essentially on initial conditions like soil quality, climate, disease environment, very importantly, the abundance of resources. Right? So Europeans settled in attractive regions which had reasonably good soil quality in terms of growing wheat, if nothing to which they were used to, and it had sort of a similar temperate zone like Europe, like North America, and disease environment wasn't that severe as it was in the Caribbean and especially north of South America, right? South America next to that was characterized with very abundant natural resources, like back then, which was not initially, but tobacco, sugar, coffee, so on and so forth, right? So the argument here is that, Europeans settled in North America, where the disease environment wasn't that horrible, but there weren't much resources to benefit from, so they had to transplant good institutions alongside them. Right? They had to transplant good institutions in order to prosper in North America, right? Because they also couldn't just live off growing sugar, tobacco, and so on and so forth. In South America, conditions were actually different. Disease environment was horrible, at least in North South America, right? Disease environment was horrible, but it was characterized by very rich natural resources. So you had every incentive in the world to not to move there, but just design institutions that would extract as much money as possible from these regions of the world. And possibly, shipping slaves there to work on these plantations of farms and so on and so forth, right? I mean, obviously slaves were characterizing south of the United States precisely because the climate was kind of similar in that sense, right? So this kind of type of settler colonies, whether it was a settler colony or extractive colony, basically impacted this functionality of South America. Nowadays, in particular, impacted the extremely high levels of inequality that we have in South America because we had a tiny elite, which were, European whites who were owning the plantation, and all the slaves, indigenous people working for them, right? North America situation completely different, at least when it comes to the east coast of North America, right? So the south of North America is different. So this is, second. So we talked about institutions, geography. Let's talk about the final source, ultimate source of economic growth, which is culture, right? Which is culture. So not only institutions and geography matters, but also how you view education, investment, what kind of attitudes you have towards technology, and so on and so forth, right? And this is sort of one of the most oldest explanations, actually, why some countries are rich and others are poor, and was, built by Max Weber, who was, one of the greatest social scientists in general, doing all sorts of things. So he made the observation that Protestants, and this is data from the 1900s, he didn't have this graph, but he kind of saw something similar, that Protestant countries tend to be much richer than countries that are Catholic. Right? So he focused on Christianity, but he said that Protestant countries tend to be richer than Catholic countries, right? And sort of the oldest explanation behind that is that, Protestants believed in this idea of predestination to heaven or to hell, and one way how you can prove your predestination to heaven or to hell was through hard work. Right? So you kind of accumulate as much as resources in this world, in the reality, in order to demonstrate to other people you're probably predestined to heaven because you're such a good worker, hard worker, and so on and so forth. We don't know whether that is the case, but we do know for sure that Protestantism put an extreme emphasis on reading the Bible. Right? So Catholic Church is a giant institution whereby it serves as sort of an intermediary between you as a believer and God. Right? This is the point of the clergy. They interpret the Bible. The point of Protestantism was that there shouldn't be any intermediary between you and the God. You should just read the Bible yourself. And if you're going to put these norms out there, this motivated people to start to read, to develop literacy skills, maybe numeracy skills, which then led to an increase in human capital. Right? So the idea here was that Protestantism sort of inadvertently impacted the human capital of individuals. Right? It kind of motivated people to learn to be able to read the Bible, and then being able to read also other stuff turned out to be important. Right? Not in the 16th century, but it became more important in the 18th, 19th century with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and so on and so forth, right? So the ultimate question is, what is culture? Right? And culture is a much more fuzzier concept, right? We all have an idea of what is culture, but it's very difficult to define what it is exactly, right? So one classical definition is, these are norms of behavior, typically informal one, that shape your attitudes toward work, education, investment, innovation. So institutions are very formal. Culture is more informal. It doesn't tend to be written down. Or let me give you kind of my informal definition of culture, right? I would say a culture is something that makes you behave in a certain way without you being certain why, right? At least in a social sense, right? So you behave in a certain way, you can't really define it exactly why you're behaving in that way, right? And let me give you, another wonderful example of culture. I didn't put the authors here, but it's two economists who wrote this. And it's like a really beautiful paper, but it's in a very qualitative paper, really nicely explained. So they're trying to explain, why Jews tend to be, in any country where Jews are a reasonably sizable minority, they tend to be overrepresented in, university, science, white-collar jobs, essentially jobs that demand a high level of human capital. Right? So they tend to be characterized by very high degree of human capital relative to the remainder of the society where they are located or where they live. So they argue that Jews, in really ancient history, so at the time of the Roman invasion of Judea, were not in any way better educated than, say, an average citizen of the Roman Empire or something like that. If nothing, they were even worse educated. They argued the destruction of the temple, right, in the world, the temple in 17 AD by the Romans was sort of a pivotal moment. Right? They lost this physical place of worship, so the physical, symbol of their culture. They became dispersed all over the world. And in order to preserve their culture, a new norm emerged in the sense that it was the father's duty now to teach the reading of Torah to his kids, right? In order to preserve Judaism and the culture of their ancestors, right? So you may or not be aware of it, but in Jewish culture, you have this thing called bar mitzvah, which is the entry into adulthood. And in this event, the kid is supposed to read the Torah, right? And it's sort of a beautiful, cultural norm whereby you mark the entry into adulthood by being able to read. And so kind of in a way that what separates kids from adults is being able to read, right? And this is not in the 19th century. This is something that's happening in the 3rd or 4th or 5th century. So this norm of reading, right, not necessarily the Holy Scripture, just being able to read essentially brought them a comparative advantage in human capital, in terms of accumulating human capital and putting a high emphasis on education and so on and so forth, which back 2,000 years ago, being able to read was completely unimportant because everybody was a peasant, nobody needed to read. But later on it became a comparative advantage, right? It increased human capital, their literacy, economic growth, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, you can also think about this, in terms of modern day China, which had this kind of tremendous emphasis on imperial examination, entering the bureaucracy, which was open to, ordinary citizens, and has this presumably somehow impacted, the great emphasis that modern day Chinese put on education, right? Okay, so we can conclude actually now. So what does it all mean? So at approximate level, economic growth is caused by investment into education and health, new structures and equipment, and technology and efficiency. So these are sources of economic growth. So institutions, culture, and geography matter because they shape the incentives of you as individuals to invest into education and health, and shape the incentives of firms to invest into machinery, structures, technology, and so on and so forth. Institutions and culture can be improved, more or less, right? I mean, they're all very rigid, right? So kind of bad news is, institutions don't really change very quickly, and they tend to change by completely dramatic events, like, for example, the French Revolution, right? Culture also tends to be extremely rigid, but it can change, right? You can think about, sort of attitudes towards homosexuals over the past 200 years. They have changed dramatically. So culture is very rigid, but it can change. Geography, you can't really change your location where you are in the world. You can't really change, your location if you're Sri Lanka. But it can be improved indirectly for eliminating, effective business to markets for new technologies, right? So they're very rigid, institutions, culture, and geography. They can change. Institutions are probably easiest to change, like rules and regulations, which is why we focus on them so much in this course. And let's see each other on Friday in class to discuss this thing.